در سال 1844 میلادی در افق تاریخ روحانی بشریت فجری دیگر دمید.
In the year 1844, dawn broke once again in the spiritual history of mankind with the opening of the most glorious epic ever witnessed. On May 23rd of that year, the Baha'i era was born when a young man in Shiraz declared that he was none other than the promised Ghaim, the high prophet or Messiah, so eagerly awaited by the faith of Islam. This central figure of so sublime a drama was known as the Bab, which means the gate. He referred to himself as
the primal point from which have been generated all created things, the countenance of God, whose splendor can never be obscured, the light of God, whose radiance can never fade.
Persia in 1844 was perhaps the most cruel and immoral culture in the world, a startling contrast to its glorious past. After the revelation of Muhammad and the spread of Islam, Persia had become distinguished among all nations for its flourishing civilization and learning. It became widely known as a center of sciences and arts and was admired as a font of virtues. But then, as the Islamic faith split into quarreling sects and the teachings of Muhammad slowly became defiled, the culture of Persia disintegrated and its government slid into an unprecedented system of power brokering and corruption. In God Passes By, Shoghi Effendi tells us about the world into which the new faith of the Bab was born.
The people among whom he appeared were the most decadent race in the civilized world. Grossly ignorant, savage, cruel, steeped in prejudice, servile in their submission to an almost deified hierarchy. Recalling in their abjectness the Israelites of Egypt in the days of Moses, in their fanaticism the Jews in the days of Jesus, and in their perversity the idolaters of Arabia in the days of Muhammad.
It was in the midst of these perverse conditions that the Bab not only declared his station, but also revealed his Badiyan, proclaimed a new code of religious law, and instituted a profound moral and spiritual reform. This threatened the government and the clergy, who rose against the Bab in relentless opposition. Fierce persecution of the new faith and its believers was supported by the entire Shia ecclesiastical hierarchy, by two leaders of the Qajar dynasty and their wicked ministers, by the military, and by a violently hostile public. During the 9 years of the Bab's ministry, more than 20,000 believers laid down their lives.
تن آدمی شریف است به جان آدمیت، نه همین لباس زیباست نشان آدمیت. Though I testify the human temple is honorable, refined, yet the garment's beauty of humanity's grandeur is no sign. For mankind will soar until it sees not but the divine. Observe then how noble its attire, its heights, how sublime.
The Bab's father and mother were both descendants of the Prophet Muhammad and were loved and respected by the people. Shoghi Effendi describes this lineage.
He who both on his father's and mother's side was of the seed of the illustrious Fatimeh, and who was a descendant of the Imam Hussein, the most eminent among the lawful successors of the Prophet of Islam.
In early childhood, the Bab lost his father and was subsequently reared by his maternal uncle, Haji Mirza Sayyid Ali. His uncle placed the Bab under the care of a tutor named Sheikh Abid, a man of piety and learning. One day Sheikh Abid asked the Bab to recite the opening words of the Quran and to explain their meaning. The Bab spoke with such knowledge and fluency that the tutor was struck with amazement. He returned the Bab to his uncle and said, "I have brought him back to you, and commit him to your vigilant protection. He is not to be treated as a mere child, for in him I can already discern evidences of that mysterious power which the revelation of the Lord of Age alone can reveal. It is incumbent upon you to surround him with your most loving care. Keep him in your home, for he verily stands in no need of teachers such as I." The wife of the Bab, Khadija Begum, perceived the glory and uniqueness of his mission and felt the intensity of his force. One night the Bab arose from his bed and left the room. His wife explained what happened next.
At first, I took no particular notice of his absence, but when it lengthened to more than an hour, I felt some concern. Then I went out to look for him, but he was nowhere to be found. I went up the steps at the northern side of the courtyard. There I saw him standing in the chamber, his hand raised heavenwards, intoning a prayer in a most melodious voice, with tears streaming down his face, and his face was luminous. Rays of light radiated from it. He looked so majestic and resplendent that fear seized me, and I stood transfixed where I was, trembling uncontrollably. I could neither enter the room nor retrace my steps. My willpower was gone, and I was on the point of screaming when he made a gesture with his blessed hands, telling me to go back. The movement of his hand gave me back my courage, and I returned to my room and my bed. The next morning, when he asked me what it was that troubled me, I boldly replied that it was the change in him which weighed heavily on my mind. He smiled and said, although he had not wished to be seen by me in the condition of the previous night, God had ordained otherwise. He said,
"It was the will of God that you should have seen me in the way that you did last night, so that no shadow of doubt should ever cross your mind, and you should come to know with absolute certitude that I am the manifestation of God, whose advent has been expected for 1,000 years. This light radiates from my heart and from my being."
As soon as I heard him speak these words, I believed in him. I prostrated myself before him, and my heart became calm and assured. From that moment, I lived only to serve him, evanescent and self-effacing before him, no thought of self ever intruding.
One day it came time for the Bab's wife to bear him a child. There was great difficulty in the delivery, and she was on the verge of death. The Bab's mother asked him to do something to prevent the tragedy. The Bab took a mirror that was nearby, wrote a prayer on it, and instructed his mother to hold the mirror in front of his wife. That done, the child was safely delivered, a son whom they named Ahmad. In the Gospel of John, chapter 2, there's a similar story of Jesus obeying the bidding of his mother. The event took place at a wedding in Cana. When the wine for the celebration ran out, Mary turned to Jesus and said,
"They have no more wine."
"Woman, how does this concern of yours involve me? My hour has not yet come."
Then she instructed the servants,
"Do whatever he tells you."
Jesus instructed them to fill jars with water. After having done so, they gave the water-made wine to the master of the feast to taste, who declared it to be the choicest wine. This was the first of the signs performed by Jesus, thereby revealing his glory, and it was done at the bidding of his mother. Though the Bab had assured the safe delivery of his son upon his mother's request, Ahmad died soon after birth. The Bab's mother was both grieved and angry. She remonstrated with her son that if he had such powers, why had he not made an attempt to preserve the life of the child and spare his wife so much suffering? The Bab replied that he was not destined to leave any progeny, an answer which infuriated his mother, who could not at that time understand its meaning. These events echo the story of Abraham, who was asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, or according to the Quran, Ismael. With complete trust in God, Abraham prepared his son and raised the knife before God mercifully spared his son's life. By yielding to God's will, the Bab, who had demonstrated the power to intervene, became Abraham in his willingness to sacrifice his son. This time, a destiny greater than Abraham's was in motion, one that would require even greater sacrifice. The Bab consecrated the death of Ahmad with these words,
O God, my God, would that 1,000 Ishmaels were given me, this Abraham of thine, that I might have offered them each and all as a loving sacrifice unto thee. O my beloved, my heart's desire, the sacrifice of this Ahmad, whom thy servant Ali Muhammad hath offered up on the altar of thy love, can never suffice to quench the flame of longing in his heart. Not until he immolates his own heart at thy feet, not until his whole body falls a victim to the cruelest tyranny in thy path, not until his breast is made a target for countless darts for thy sake, will the tumult of his soul be stilled. O my God, my only desire, grant that the sacrifice of my son, my only son, may be acceptable unto thee. Grant that it be a prelude to the sacrifice of my own, my entire self in the path of thy good pleasure. Endue with thy grace my life-blood, which I yearn to shed in thy path. Cause it to water and nourish the seed of thy faith. Endow it with thy celestial potency, that this infant seed of God may soon germinate in the hearts of men, that it may thrive and prosper, that it may grow to become a mighty tree, beneath the shadow of which all the peoples and kindreds of the earth may gather. Answer thou my prayer, O God, and fulfill my most cherished desire. Thou art verily the Almighty, the All-Bountiful.
Allahumma ya Ilahi, Kaushin Ibrahim Torah, Hazar Ismail Bud, همه را در راه محبت تو قربانی می نمود. یا محبوبی، یا مقصود قلبی، محبت این احمد که بنده تو علی محمد او را در راه تو قربانی کرد، هیچگاه نمی تواند شعله محبت تو را که در قلبش افروخته خاموش سازد. تا جانم در پای تو نثار نشود و تا جسمم در راه تو به خاک و خون نغلطد و تا سینه‌ام برای تو هدف گلوله های بیشمار نشود، اضطراب من تسکین نیابد و دل من راحتی نپذیرد.
It was not long before the Bab would reveal his mission. The evening before that spiritual dawn in 1844, a young Muslim clergyman named Mullah Hussein encountered the Bab in the city of Shiraz, Persia. For quite a long time, Mullah Hussein and many others had been searching for the Gaim, the Promised One, whom they were certain had come. The Bab invited Mullah Hussein to his home and there declared himself to be the Promised One. Almost as if disbelieving his good fortune, Mullah Hussein felt compelled to test the veracity of this claim. His wise teacher, Sayyid Kazemzadeh, had told him that when found, the Promised One, unasked, would reveal a commentary on the Surah of Joseph. The Surah of Joseph was revealed by Muhammad in order to prove the truth of his mission, in response to a challenge. This became one of the proofs by which others could judge the Promised One to come. And this commentary would penetrate and explain many of the mysteries and perplexities of that surah, which had eluded even the most scholarly religious leaders of the past. This explains the astonishment that Mullah Hussein must have felt when, in the middle of their conversation, the Bab suddenly said,
Now is the time to reveal the commentary on the Surah of Joseph.
With pen in hand, the Bab wrote and narrated the commentary on the Surah of Joseph. This commentary became the first chapter in his mighty tablet, the Qayyum-ul-Asma. The words flowed from him effortlessly, like a gentle stream of water, without any hesitation or interruption, as if wholly realized at once and just now unveiled in perfect form. The fundamental theme of this commentary was to forecast what the true Joseph, Baha'u'llah, a manifestation of God who would immediately succeed the Bab, would endure at the hands of one who was at once his half-brother and his arch-enemy. The story of Joseph found in the Quran, though originally from Genesis, describes the jealous actions of evil brothers against a good and favored son. Having convinced their father Jacob they would watch over Joseph, the brothers took him into a far-off land and threw him into a well. They returned home and told their father that a wolf had devoured Joseph. Jacob was so heartbroken that he became blind with grief. Joseph was discovered by a passing caravan and was taken to Egypt, where he was sold for a paltry sum. In the words of Muhammad,
"Thus we found in that land a home for Joseph, and taught him to interpret mysteries. Allah has power over all things, though most men may not know it. And when he reached maturity, we bestowed upon him wisdom and knowledge. Thus we reward the righteous."
Joseph possessed a beautiful countenance. When women saw him, they swooned at his beauty and exclaimed, "God preserve us! This is no mortal, but a gracious angel." In Egypt, Joseph became the personal servant of the king, who put him in charge of the granaries of the realm. Then one day during the drought, Joseph's brothers came and presented themselves before him, asking for some grain. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they were blind to his identity. They were asked to return at another time, and when they did, Joseph made himself known to them. Graciously he gave them corn, and told them to take his garment and throw it over the face of his father. "He will recover his sight," he explained. When the caravan approached Jacob, they did this, and Jacob said,
"I feel the breath of Joseph, though you will not believe me."
The metaphor of the fragrant garment is frequently used in the Baha'i writings to refer to the recognition of the manifestation of God and His revelation. The phrase, "the sweet-smelling savor of my garment can be smelled," can refer to the laws which Baha'u'llah has given us in the Kitab-i-Aqdas. In one of his tablets, Baha'u'llah describes himself as a divine Joseph, who has been bartered away by the heedless for the most paltry of prices. In the Qayyum-ul-Azma, the Bab identifies Baha'u'llah as the true Joseph and forecasts the ordeals that he would endure at the hands of his treacherous half-brother. He also tells of Baha'u'llah's station as the beauty of the Lord, the glory of the Lord. The poets of the past have prophesied of the return of Joseph.
یوسف گم گشته باز آید به کنعان، غم مخور، کلبه احزان شود روزی گلستان، غم مخور. ای دل غم دیده حالت به شود، دل بد مکن، این سر شوریده باز آید به سامان، غم مخور. Forsaken Joseph to Canaan will return. Upon the thorny stalks of family grief, a rose shall bloom. Turbulent, grieving heart, be sanguine. You shall soon find peace. Spare not.
As dawn approached on that eventful morning in 1844, the Bab secretly revealed to Mullah Hussein his mission to be the Bab, or gate, through whom another manifestation of God would become known, one who would be the true Joseph and the beauty of the Lord. Mullah Hussein found himself enraptured by his young host. In his own words,
I sat spellbound by his utterance, oblivious of time and of those who awaited me. This revelation, so suddenly and impetuously thrust upon me, came as a thunderbolt which for a time seemed to have benumbed my faculties. I was blinded by its dazzling splendor and overwhelmed by its crushing force. Excitement, joy, awe, and wonder stirred the depths of my soul. Predominant among these emotions was a sense of gladness and strength which seemed to have transfigured me. The knowledge of his revelation had galvanized my being.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليًا ولي الله.
At dawn, when the Muslim call to prayer sounded, Mullah Hussein awoke as if from a reverie. Was it morning already? Stunned by the revelations he alone had heard, Mullah Hussein felt that he was an instrument through which the voice of Gabriel was calling to all mankind.
Awake, for lo, the morning light has broken. Arise, for his cause is made manifest. The portal of his grace is open wide. Enter therein, O people of the world. For he who is your promised one is come.
With this historic declaration, the dawn of an age that signalized the consummation of all ages had broken. The first impulse of a momentous revelation had been communicated to the one person, according to the testimony of the Katabi-i-Kan, but for whom God would not have been established upon the seat of his mercy, nor ascended the throne of eternal glory. The Bab fulfilled the promise of all ages and ushered in the consummation of the revelations of previous manifestations of God. To the Shia Muslims, he is the Qaim, meaning he who ariseth. To the Sunnis, he is the Mahdi, meaning one who is guided. He is the return of John the Baptist expected by the Christians. The Ushi-Dharma, referred to in the Zoroastrian scriptures, the return of Elijah, anticipated by the Jews. Shoghi Effendi states that Baha'u'llah himself referred to the Bab as
the remembrance of God, concerning whom a separate covenant hath been established with each and every prophet.
He called the Bab
one of the sustaining pillars of the primal word of God, the mystic flame, the great announcement, the flame of that supernal light that glowed upon Sinai, the primal point, from which have been generated all created things.
The advent of the Bab at once signaled the end of the prophetic cycle and the beginning of the cycle of fulfillment. Through his revelation, which he revealed that fateful morning, he simultaneously banished the shades of night that had descended upon his country and proclaimed the impending rise of one whose radiance would envelop all mankind. The heroes of the spiritual battle to follow were the Bab's chosen disciples, whom he called the Letters of the Living, and their courageous companions. These men and women were standard-bearers of a faith and a code of conduct that challenged and revolutionized the lives of their countrymen. In the end, there would be 18 Letters of the Living. The 17th letter was the first woman, a poetess named Tahireh. In a few short years, she would play a major role in proclaiming the inauguration of a new dispensation. The last Letter of the Living, though first in rank, was Godus, the youngest of them all. Through his mother, Godus was a direct descendant of the Imam Hassan, or Prophet Muhammad. Godus was immortalized by the Bab as the last name of God, and later would be called the last point by both the Bab and Baha'u'llah. This showed that Godus was the most important Bábí next to the Bab himself. Baha'u'llah referred to the Bab as the primal point. These Letters of the Living are addressed in the writings as
the first letters generated from the primal point, this company of angels arrayed before God on the day of his coming, these repositories of his mystery, these springs that have welled out from the source of his revelation.
In the words of the Persian Badiyan, these first companions
enjoy nearest access to God. They are luminaries that have from everlasting bowed down and will everlastingly continue to bow down before the celestial throne. They are the elders mentioned in the book of Revelation as sitting before God on their seats, clothed in white raiment, wearing on their heads crowns of gold.
When all the Letters of the Living finally had been identified, they were summoned to the Bab's presence, who addressed to them his parting words, entrusted to each of them a specific task, and assigned the provinces where they were to carry out their task. A few years later, when the Bab's power and fame were steadily growing, his enemies, including the chief constable Abdul Hamid Khan, by order of the governor, scaled the wall of his uncle's house in the dead of night to arrest the Bab and confiscate his writings. That very night an outbreak of cholera occurred. Amid shrieks of pain and grief, the inhabitants of the stricken city were fleeing in confusion. Confronted by this unexpected development, the chief constable decided to take the Bab to his own home. When they arrived, he was appalled to find his son in the death throes of the plague. In his despair, he threw himself at the feet of the Bab, begged to be forgiven, adjured him to save his son rather than visit upon the son the sins of the father, and pledged his word to resign his post and never again to accept such a position. The Bab asked for some water and performed ablution, then told the chief constable to give the water to the son to drink. In doing so, his prayer was answered. The chief constable then addressed a plea to the governor, begging him to release his captive. The governor, Hussein Khan, acceded to this request and released his prisoner on condition that the Bab leave the city. The Bab gave each letter of the living a specific task, but to the care of Mullah Hussein he committed a mission more important than the others. He began by affirming that his covenant with Mullah Hussein had been established, then cautioning him to be forbearing with the Islamic clerics he would encounter. Then he instructed Mullah Hussein to go to Tehran. In the most glowing terms, he alluded to an unrevealed mystery enshrined in that city, a mystery that would transcend the light shed by both Hijaz, the physical place where Muslims prepare for the journey to Mecca, and Shiraz, Persia's center of spirituality and poetry. This is where Mullah Hussein encountered Baha'u'llah. The Bab spent many of his remaining years in captivity. While imprisoned in Maku and Sharik, he wrote the monumental repository of the laws and precepts of the new dispensation, and often referred to that unrevealed mystery as him whom God will make manifest. This frequent and prophetic announcement is highlighted by Shoghi Effendi.
Well it is with him who fixeth his gaze upon the order of Baha'u'llah, and rendereth thanks unto his Lord, for he will assuredly be made manifest. God hath indeed irrevocably ordained it in the Bayan.
The Bab was conscious from the very beginning of his twofold mission, the bearer of a wholly independent revelation and the herald of one still greater than his own. In his writings he affirmed that, through the prophets of all ages, God had entered into the greater covenant with all mankind, and this covenant had been fulfilled. He also described the lesser covenant in clear and unequivocal language, unlike in previous dispensations when such a covenant had been couched in obscure language. The lesser covenant, he said, was made with his followers concerning the one whose advent would be the fruit and ultimate purpose of his dispensation. This lesser covenant fixed the date of the promised revelation of Baha'u'llah, extolled its virtues, asserted its preeminent character, and tore down every barrier that might be an obstacle to its recognition. The revelation of the Bab stands wholly unparalleled in the annals of religion, amounting to more than 500,000 verses on countless subjects. Baha'u'llah in the Kitab-e-Ikan testifies that
the verses which have rained from this cloud of divine mercy have been so abundant that none hath yet been able to estimate their number. A score of volumes are now available. How many still remain beyond our reach? How many have been plundered and have fallen into the hands of the enemy, the fate of which none knoweth.
The laws underlying the Bab's dispensation were revealed by him during 3 years of imprisonment in the mountains of Azerbaijan, but the dispensation itself was inaugurated at the conference of Badasht. The purpose of that conference was to implement the revelation of the Bayan by a sudden and complete dramatic break with the past, with the old religious order, its ecclesiasticism, its traditions, and ceremonials. A secondary purpose was to consider the means of freeing the Bab from his cruel confinement in Sharik. The first was eminently successful. The second was destined to fail. On that memorable day, the bugle mentioned in the Quran was sounded. The stunning trumpet blast was loudly raised, and the catastrophe came to pass. The days immediately following witnessed a veritable revolution in the outlook, habits, and manner of worship of these previously devout upholders of the Muhammadan law.
در ایام مبارک شخصی بود مفتون محبت الله. امر فرمودند که این ابیات را دائما قرائت و به لحن خوش تلاوت نماید. ای عشق منم از تو سرگشته و سودایی، و در همه عالم مشهور به شیدایی. در نامه مجنونان از نام من آغازند، زین پیش اگر بودم سردفتر دانایی.
I am lost, O love, possessed and dazed. Love's fool am I in all the earth. They call me first among the crazed, though I once came first for wit and worth. O love, who sellest me this wine, O love, for whom I burn and bleed, love, for whom I cry and pine, thou the piper, I the reed. If thou wishest me to live, through me blow thy holy breath. The touch of Jesus thou wilt give to me who've lain an age in death. Thou both end and origin, thou without and thou within. From every eye thou hidest well, and yet in every eye dost dwell.
The spark ignited by the declaration of the Bab's mission was being fanned into flame by the activities of his appointed disciples. The implications of a revelation thrust so dramatically upon a race so degenerate excited the fiercest passions of fear, hate, rage, and envy. The outrage eventually assumed such proportions that the Shah, unable to ignore the situation, delegated the trusted Vahid to investigate and report to him the situation. Vahid was one of the most erudite, eloquent, and influential of the Shah's subjects, a man who had committed to memory no fewer than 30,000 Islamic traditions. In the course of 3 interviews, Vahid was completely won over by the arguments and personality of the Bab, and arose to dedicate his entire life and resources to the service of the new faith.
شیراز پرغوغا شود، شکر لبی پیدا شود، ترسم که آشوب لبش برهم زند بغداد را. Shiraz shall tumultuous be, and one sweet-lipped there shall be, the wonders of whose lips shall set Baghdad a-trembling.
The Bab was summoned finally to Tabriz by the Grand Vizier, who issued an order for the immediate assembly of the ecclesiastical dignitaries. Their avowed purpose was to arraign the Bab and deliberate on the steps to be taken for the elimination of his so-called heresy. Their hidden agenda was to consider the most effective means, once and for all, to extinguish the flames of the Bab's pervasive power. Unwittingly, this assembly gave him the supreme opportunity of his mission to assert in public, formally and without any reservation, the claims inherent in his revelation. The Bab arrived amidst the throes of wild excitement by those followers who joyously hailed his arrival in Tabriz. Having seated himself in the chief place which had been reserved for the heir to the throne, the Bab gave his celebrated answer to the question put to him by the president of that assembly.
I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word and to pledge allegiance to my person.
Relentless persecution would follow. 4 months before the martyrdom of the Bab, 7 of his disciples were martyred in Tehran. Among them was his maternal uncle who had raised him. In his eulogy, the Bab refers to these 7 martyrs as the 7 goats of Islamic tradition who on the Day of Judgment would walk in front of the promised Gaim, and whose death would precede the impending martyrdom of their true shepherd. The Bab himself had foreshadowed his own approaching death in one of his last works. He alluded to the fact that the 6th Nowruz after the declaration of his mission would be the last one he was destined to celebrate on earth. In the Qayyum-ul-Azma, he actually prophesied the end of his glorious career. Well aware of the impending trials that were to afflict him, the Bab confided in a letter to his wife the secret of what was to befall him and revealed to her a special prayer. He assured her that the reading of it would resolve her perplexities and allay her sorrows. The time of the Bab's inevitable martyrdom by firing squad finally came. The historian Nabíl records the events of the previous evening.
That night, the face of the Bab was aglow with joy, a joy such as had never shone from his countenance. He said,
"Tomorrow will be the day of my martyrdom. Would that one of you might now arise and with his own hands end my life. I prefer to be slain by the hand of a friend rather than by that of the enemy."
Tears rained from our eyes as we heard him express that wish. We shrank, however, at the thought of taking away with our own hands so precious a life. We refused and remained silent. Anis suddenly sprang to his feet and announced himself ready to obey whatever the Bab might desire. As soon as we had intervened and forced him to abandon that thought, the Bab declared,
"This same youth who hath risen to comply with my wish will together with me suffer martyrdom. Him will I choose to share with me its crown."
Anis had the honor of being martyred with the Bab because of his obedience to his Lord. Through this action, another Islamic prophecy was fulfilled. An Islamic tradition says, "The first and the last shall become one." The Shia Muslims believe God has 2 names, and these names are made out of Ali and Muhammad. The Bab's given name was Ali Muhammad, and Anis's given name was Muhammad Ali. At the death by firing squad of the Bab and Anis, their mutilated bodies became one and inseparable. Ali Muhammad and Muhammad Ali. The first and the last became one. To this day, the shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel contains the bodies of both. The Bab, who is Gaim and Mehdi the return of John the Baptist and Elijah, who was to manifest the perfection of Moses, the radiance of Jesus, and the patience of Job, had appeared, had proclaimed his cause, had been persecuted mercilessly, and had died gloriously.
قل الله يكفي كل شيء عن كل شيء ولا يكفي عن الله ربك من شيء لا في السماوات ولا في الأرض ولا ما بينهما إنه كان اللهم كافيا قديرا